The morning mist clung to the Wyoming mountains like a shroud as Robert Mitchell cinched the saddle one final time on Thunder, his trusted quarter horse. It was March 15th, 1982, and the crisp mountain air carried the scent of pine and the promise of spring. At 38 years old, Robert knew every trail, every canyon, every dangerous pass in the Teton County wilderness like the back of his weathered hands. "Dad, can we take the high trail today?" 12-year-old Sarah Mitchell asked, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air. Her auburn hair was braided tight under her worn cowboy hat, and her green eyes sparkled with the same adventurous spirit that had made her father one of the most respected ranch hands in Jackson Hole. "We'll see, sweetheart," Robert replied, checking the cinch on Sarah's mare Buttercup. "Weather's supposed to turn later. Don't want your mother worrying more than she already does. If you're enjoying this mystery, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You won't want to miss how this incredible story unfolds." The Mitchell family had lived on the Lazy J Ranch for 8 years. Robert worked as the head wrangler, while his wife Elena managed the ranch's guest accommodations. Sarah had been riding since she could walk, and locals often said she was born in the saddle. The family was well known and respected throughout the tight-knit community of Jackson Hole. "Promise me you'll be back by noon," Elena called from the porch, wrapping her shawl tighter against the morning chill. Her dark hair framed a face marked by years of Wyoming winters, but her smile still lit up whenever she looked at her husband and daughter. "Always am, mi amor," Robert called back, using the Spanish endearment that had become their tradition. He'd learned it during his time working ranches in New Mexico, and it never failed to make Elena smile. At exactly 7:30 a.m., neighbor Jake Henderson watched from his property line as the father-daughter duo rode toward the tree line, their horses' hooves creating small puffs of dust on the frost-covered trail. It would be the last time anyone would see Robert and Sarah Mitchell alive. The morning sun climbed higher, burning off the mist to reveal the stunning landscape of the Teton Range. Sarah chattered excitedly about her upcoming 13th birthday, planned for the following month. She'd been begging for a new bridle for Buttercup, one with silver conchos like the professional barrel racers used. "Dad, do you think Mom will let me enter the junior rodeo this summer?" Sarah asked as they rode deeper into the wilderness. "If you keep improving like you have been, I don't see why not," Robert replied, pride evident in his voice. "But remember, it's not just about being fearless. The best riders know when to push and when to be cautious." They followed their usual route through Cascade Canyon, a well-traveled path that Robert had guided tourists on countless times. The trail wound through dense forest before opening into meadows that, in a few months, would be carpeted with wildflowers. But today the landscape was still locked in winter's grip. Don't forget to like this video if you're invested in finding out what happened to this father and daughter. As they climbed higher, the temperature dropped noticeably. Robert noticed, the wind picking up, and glanced at his watch. 9:15 a.m. They were making good time, but something felt different about this morning. Maybe it was the way the clouds were gathering to the west, or perhaps it was the unusual silence in the forest. Even the birds seemed to have gone quiet. "Let's head toward Willow Creek," Robert decided, guiding Thunder onto a less-traveled path. "Haven't checked the old line shack in a while." The line shack was a small cabin used by ranchers during cattle drives, located about 10 miles from the main ranch. It served as a waypoint for riders venturing into the more remote areas of the range. Robert sometimes used it as a rest stop during longer rides with guests. As they rode, Sarah's excitement was infectious. She pointed out animal tracks in the muddy sections of the trail and identified bird calls with the expertise of someone who'd grown up in the wilderness. These were the moments Robert treasured most, just him and his daughter sharing the land he loved. Neither of them noticed the fresh tire tracks cutting across their path about 5 miles in, or the way certain trees showed recent damage from heavy equipment. The remoteness that made this area perfect for peaceful rides also made it perfect for activities that required absolute privacy. At 10:30 a.m. they reached a fork in the trail that Robert had traveled hundreds of times before. To the left led toward Willow Creek and the line shack. To the right was a newer path, one that hadn't existed the last time he'd been in this area. Curious about who had been developing trails on what he thought was protected forest land, Robert made a decision that would seal their fate. "Let's see where this goes," he said, guiding Thunder to the right. As they rode deeper into unfamiliar territory, the sound of their horses' hooves was gradually joined by another sound, the distant rumble of engines and the lowing of cattle. Lots of cattle. Chapter 2 is coming up next, and trust me, what they discover will change everything you think you know about this case. Make sure to comment below with your theories about what happened. The sound grew louder as Robert and Sarah crested a small ridge. What they saw in the valley below made Robert's blood run cold and caused Sarah to gasp audibly. Spread across the hidden meadow were hundreds of cattle, far more than any legitimate operation should have in this remote location. Several semi-trucks were parked at the far end of the valley, and men with rifles were directing the movement of the animals into loading chutes. This wasn't a normal ranching operation. This was something much more sinister. Robert's years of experience told him immediately what he was looking at: a cattle rustling operation on a massive scale. The stolen animals were being prepared for transport, likely to buyers in other states where their identities could be obscured. The location was perfect. Remote enough to avoid detection, yet accessible by the logging roads that crisscrossed this part of the forest. "Dad, what is this?" Sarah whispered, her voice tight with fear. "Nothing good, sweetheart," Robert replied quietly, his mind racing. "We need to get out of here, now." But as he turned Thunder around, the sound of hoofbeats approaching fast made his heart sink. They'd been spotted. 3 men on horseback emerged from the trees behind them, cutting off their escape route. The lead rider was a tall, lean man with cold gray eyes, and a scar running down his left cheek. Robert recognized him immediately. Bull Henderson, Jake's estranged brother who'd been suspected of various crimes over the years but never convicted. Well, Bull called out, his voice carrying a menacing edge. "Robert Mitchell and his little girl? You two are a long way from home. If this story is keeping you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button and let me know in the comments what you think happens next." Robert positioned Thunder between Sarah and the approaching men, his hand instinctively moving toward the rifle secured to his saddle, but he was outnumbered, and Sarah's safety was his primary concern. "Bull," Robert said evenly, trying to keep his voice calm. "We were just riding. Didn't mean to stumble onto anything. We'll just head back the way we came." Bull laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I'm afraid that's not going to be possible, Robert. You see, what you've witnessed here today never happened, and the only way to guarantee that is to make sure you never tell anyone about it." The other 2 men had spread out, surrounding Robert and Sarah. One was Danny Kowalski, a drifter who'd worked various ranches in the area. The other Robert didn't recognize, a hard-faced man with prison tattoos visible on his forearms. "Please," Robert said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. "My daughter has nothing to do with this. Let her go. She's just a child." "Daddy?" Sarah's voice was small and frightened. Bull considered this for a moment, then shook his head. "Can't take that risk. Girl's old enough to talk, old enough to identify faces. Besides, she's seen too much already." The next few minutes unfolded with the terrible inevitability of a nightmare. Robert tried to make a break for it, spurring Thunder toward what looked like the clearest escape route. But the men were ready for him. Shots rang out across the valley, echoing off the canyon walls. Thunder stumbled and went down, throwing Robert hard against a boulder. Sarah screamed and tried to ride to her father's aid on Buttercup, but Danny Kowalski was already there, grabbing the mare's reins. Robert struggled to his feet, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead, and faced the men who had destroyed his family. His last conscious thought was of Elena waiting at home for them to return for lunch. Subscribe now if you want to see how this tragedy was finally solved after 18 years of mystery. The rustlers worked efficiently, disposing of evidence with the practiced ease of men who'd done this before. They moved the bodies to a location miles away from the rustling operation, in a deep ravine where they'd never be found by casual hikers or search parties, but they made one crucial mistake. In their haste to clean up the scene, they buried Robert's distinctive leather saddle, the one with his initials RM, carved into the cantle, in a different location, planning to retrieve it later when the heat died down. It was a beautiful piece of craftsmanship, too valuable to simply destroy. However, the rustling operation was shut down just days later when federal agents, acting on an unrelated tip, raided several properties connected to the cattle theft ring. Bull Henderson and his associates scattered, and in the chaos of fleeing, they never returned for the buried saddle. Years passed. Bull Henderson died in a prison fight in Nevada in 1995. Danny Kowalski overdosed on methamphetamines in a Denver flophouse in 1998. The third man, whose real name was Carlos Mendez, was deported to Mexico after serving time for armed robbery. The secret of what happened to Robert and Sarah Mitchell seemed to have died with the perpetrators. Elena Mitchell never remarried. For 18 years she kept Robert's coffee cup on the kitchen table and Sarah's bedroom exactly as her daughter had left it that March morning. The not knowing was the worst part. The endless questions, the false hopes, the gradual acceptance that they were probably gone forever. The initial search had been massive. Sheriff's deputies, park rangers, search and rescue volunteers, and even National Guard helicopters had combed thousands of acres of wilderness. They'd found Thunder's body about 2 miles from where Robert and Sarah had last been seen, which led searchers to believe the father and daughter had continued on foot after their horse was injured. If this story is hitting you in the feels, please give it a thumbs up and share it with someone who loves mysteries like this one. The official theory was that they'd gotten lost in an unexpected blizzard that had swept through the area that afternoon, just hours after they'd been last seen. Temperatures had dropped to well below zero, with wind chills reaching dangerous levels. Search teams hypothesized that Robert and Sarah had succumbed to exposure somewhere in the vast wilderness. Elena never accepted that explanation. Robert knew those mountains too well to get lost, and he was too experienced to be caught unprepared by weather. She spent her life savings hiring private investigators, psychics, and anyone else who claimed they could help find her family. All of them came up empty. The community of Jackson Hole never forgot the Mitchell family. Every year on the anniversary of their disappearance, a memorial service was held at the local Methodist church. Elena attended every one, always wearing the blue dress that Robert had said brought out her eyes. Jake Henderson, the neighbor who'd been the last to see them alive, was haunted by guilt. He'd noticed them heading toward the tree line but hadn't thought to mention the exact direction they'd taken until days later. By then, the search had already covered that area multiple times. If I'd just paid more attention, he'd tell anyone who'd listen. If I'd thought to mention they were heading toward Willow Creek instead of their usual trail. Jake never knew that his own brother was responsible for the tragedy that had devastated their close-knit community. As the years passed, new families moved to the area, and the story of Robert and Sarah Mitchell became local legend. Tour guides would sometimes point out the area where they'd disappeared, turning a family's tragedy into a ghost story for visitors. Elena aged rapidly, her dark hair turning white, her face lined with the weight of unanswered questions. She continued to work at the Lazy J Ranch, though her employers eventually transitioned her to lighter duties out of compassion for her situation. Don't forget to hit that notification bell so you don't miss the incredible conclusion to this story. By 2000, most people assumed the case would never be solved. The investigators who had worked on it originally were retired or dead. The evidence had grown cold, and the trail was 18 years old. But sometimes, the truth has a way of clawing its way back to the surface. The state of Wyoming had received federal funding to improve access to remote recreational areas, part of a broader initiative to boost tourism revenue. One of the projects involved building a new road that would provide better access to some of the more scenic areas of the Teton Range. The construction crew for Rocky Mountain Roads, Inc. began work in early spring 2000, when the ground had thawed enough to allow heavy machinery to operate effectively. The new road would cut through areas that had been virtually inaccessible to vehicles for decades. Tony Ramirez had been operating heavy equipment for 15 years, but he'd never seen anything like what his bulldozer blade unearthed on the morning of April 3, 2000. About 2 feet down, in an area that was supposed to be cleared for the new roadbed, his machine struck something that definitely wasn't rock-a-root. When he climbed down to investigate, Tony found himself staring at pieces of leather, metal, and carved wood. It took him a moment to realize what he was looking at, but when he saw the initials RM carved into what was clearly part of a saddle, he knew he'd found something significant. Tony had lived in Wyoming long enough to know the story of Robert and Sarah Mitchell. Every longtime resident did. Comment below if you think you know what's about to happen. The conclusion to this 18-year mystery is coming up next. Within hours of Tony Ramirez's discovery, the construction site was crawling with law enforcement officials. Sheriff Tom Bradley, who had been a young deputy during the original investigation, stood at the edge of the excavation site holding the pieces of Robert Mitchell's saddle. The leather was remarkably well preserved, protected by the clay soil and the depth at which it had been buried. But what struck Sheriff Bradley most was the deliberate nature of the burial. This wasn't something that had been lost or abandoned. It had been carefully buried, wrapped in what appeared to be a tarp. "This changes everything," he told Detective Maria Santos, who had driven up from Cheyenne to assist with the case. "This wasn't an accident. Someone killed them and tried to hide the evidence. If you've been following this incredible story, make sure to subscribe and hit that like button. The conclusion will shock you." Elena Mitchell was 73 years old when Sheriff Bradley knocked on her door that April afternoon. The years had been hard on her, but when she saw him standing on her porch with his hat in his hands and that familiar look of someone bearing difficult news, she straightened her shoulders and invited him in. "We found Robert's saddle, Elena," he said gently, "and we think we know what really happened." The forensic examination of the saddle revealed several crucial pieces of evidence. Microscopic analysis found traces of blood that matched Robert's blood type. More importantly, ballistics experts identified impact marks consistent with rifle bullets on the metal parts of the saddle. This physical evidence, combined with the location where the saddle was found, allowed investigators to piece together a different version of events. The site was nearly 15 miles from where the original search had been concentrated, in an area that had been used by cattle rustlers in the early 1980s. Detective Santos began interviewing people who had been involved in or had knowledge of rustling operations during that time period. It took weeks of patient detective work, but eventually she found someone willing to talk. Maria Kowalski, Danny's sister, had been carrying the burden of her brother's confession for nearly 20 years. Before his death in 1998, Danny had told her about the murders in a drug-fueled confession that had haunted her ever since. "He said they just rode into the wrong place at the wrong time," Maria told Detective Santos, tears streaming down her face. "Danny said Bull Henderson shot them, both, and they buried the bodies somewhere up in the high country where they'd never be found." Make sure to comment with your thoughts on this incredible revelation, and don't forget to subscribe for more amazing true stories like this one. With Maria Kowalski's testimony and the physical evidence from the saddle, investigators were able to reconstruct the crime with reasonable certainty. Robert and Sarah had stumbled upon a large-scale cattle rustling operation. Bull Henderson, the leader of the group, had killed them to prevent them from reporting what they'd seen. The rustlers had disposed of the bodies in a remote location but had buried the valuable saddle separately, intending to retrieve it later. However, the operation was shut down by federal agents just days after the murders, and the perpetrators had fled without returning for the buried evidence. Elena Mitchell finally had her answers, though they brought little comfort. At the press conference announcing the resolution of the case, she stood beside Sheriff Bradley and spoke in a voice steady with hard-won strength. "For 18 years, I've wondered what happened to my husband and my little girl," she said. "I've imagined every possible scenario, hoped for miracles, and prayed for answers. Now I know the truth, and while it's not the truth I wanted, it's better than not knowing." The case sparked renewed interest in several other unsolved disappearances in the area during the 1980s and 1990s. investigators began to wonder how many other families had been victims of the violent criminal enterprises that had operated in the remote areas of Wyoming during that time. Elena established the Robert and Sarah Mitchell Foundation, dedicated to improving search and rescue operations and supporting families of missing persons. She used the life insurance payouts she'd finally been able to claim, along with donations from the community, to fund equipment and training for search teams. If this story touched your heart, please share it with others. These families deserve to have their stories told. In 2003, based on information provided by other witnesses who came forward after the case was solved, investigators were able to locate the remains of Robert and Sarah Mitchell in a ravine about 12 miles from where the saddle was found. They were buried together on a hillside overlooking the Teton Range, with a view of the mountains they had both loved so much. Elena lived for 7 more years after finally learning the truth about her family's fate. She died peacefully in her sleep in 2010, at the age of 83. Those who knew her said that in her final years, she seemed to have found a measure of peace that had eluded her for so long. The story of Robert and Sarah Mitchell serves as a reminder that sometimes justice comes slowly, but it does come. Their memory lives on not just in the foundation that bears their name, but in the dozens of missing persons cases that have been solved using improved techniques and resources that were developed partly in response to their tragedy. Jake Henderson, the neighbor who had been the last to see them alive, attended Elena's funeral. In his eulogy, he spoke about the weight of carrying secrets and the importance of speaking the truth, no matter how difficult it might be. The road that Tony Ramirez was building when he found Robert's saddle was eventually completed and named Mitchell Memorial Highway. A plaque at the scenic overlook tells the story of the father and daughter who loved these mountains and lost their lives to the greed and violence of men who cared nothing for the beauty and peace they were destroying. Today, when families ride the trails around Jackson Hole, they often think of Robert and Sarah Mitchell and remember that even in the most beautiful places, evil can lurk. But they also remember that truth has a way of surviving, even when buried for 18 years in the Wyoming soil. Thank you for watching this incredible true story. If it moved you, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share it with others. Stories like these remind us that every missing person is someone's beloved family member, and they all deserve to have their truth told. What did you think of this case? Let me know in the comments below.